Okay, Denis, thanks for taking the time today to have a chat with you. As you know, we're going to talk about a couple of different things today, and we'll pick your brains a little bit around your thoughts around managerialism and what that is and how you're working in that environment at the moment. And then I want to touch a little bit on what does professionalism mean in this environment as well.
Sure.
So I might start with the big question. I guess when I say managerialism, what does that mean to you?
I guess for me it means being a good manager and being able to look at social work in a different context. So for me it's been around, it's something that I'm still learning about, and I think that ongoing learning is really important. But I think it's about looking at how do you be a good manager of social work services, of practitioners that work in the field, so having a good sense of what the issues are, excellent, good leadership and good management. So things like emotional intelligence, being able to, I think one of the challenges in managerialism is being able to stay in touch with what it's like for practitioners at the coalface.
Sure, yeah. And I guess with the focus around, the pressures of managerialism are being around, being efficient and being effective, making that dollar go a little bit further, and some of the requirements around how you might practice as a manager, that distance between being a manager and the coalface can kind of be, I'm trying to think of the right words, but can feel a long way away, I guess. Did that make sense?
I think that's one of the challenges that, for me, if I'm facing a difficulty as a manager, what I find useful sometimes, and it doesn't always work, but often what I will do is I'll go back to the basics, and I'll think, if I was a practitioner working with a family, how would I address this situation? What would be my social work practice?
Sure.
And I suppose for me, I still identify as a social worker. So for me, looking at what are those guiding principles in social work, if I was working with a family, how would I address this? And not always, but most of the time, a lot of those skills are transferable into a management role.
Yeah.
So looking at managing a team, or managing an organisation, or managing a particular service area, if I go back to those social work principles, so things like trying to be client directed, ensuring that they're not my goals, but they're actually the client's goals, and matching those up with what's required from an organisational perspective or from a funding body perspective, because often as a manager there are expectations from the funding body that you need to manage. So for me, if I reflect back on some of the roles that I've had as a practitioner, I started off my social work career as a family worker. Many of the families that I worked with had involvement with child protection. So to some extent I was in the middle. So there was a family, there was myself, and there was child protection. And what I found was that often child protection would have expectations and requirements around child safety. The family may or may not necessarily be able to meet those or agree with those. So my role was a facilitator, if you like, in terms of facilitating. Sometimes it was about facilitating a conversation, sometimes it was about negotiating the intervention plan or the plan of action, or the client goals, bringing the client on board, and being able to, I suppose, find some common ground. And I think for me, when I look at a practitioner and our funding body, some of that is parallel. So it's about being able to be a good negotiator and be able to be creative as well.
Yes, yeah.
In meeting those targets or goals that are set.
Yeah, which are often the setting of those are often out of your control as a worker. We might stay with you started talking about where you started in social work practice. Can I get you to just talk a bit about what your social work career's been like so far and where you are now, and then we might go back to some more of the other.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I started off as a locum family worker in a local not-for-profit organisation, and that I was actually still studying at the time. So for me that was about trying to get some experience, and I graduated from Bachelor of Social Work at La Trobe University in Bendigo. From there I continued on as a family worker, moved into more senior family worker roles, I was then given an opportunity to do some project work, so establishing a new children's centre. So I did that for about 12 months as a fixed project. Then I moved into a team leader role, and that was a really interesting role in that I then had to learn more about leadership and what does it mean to be a good leader and some of the challenges associated with leadership in a social work environment. And then I guess from there other opportunities grew, so looking at acting management roles. Then I moved into a different organisation where I was a manager of community services branch, so that was very broad. That included programs like school support, community development, bushfire and flood recovery, youth justice. It was a very diverse, even employment assistance programs. So as a manager, I was going out to businesses and promoting the importance of self-care of your staff and well-being and selling, if you like, counselling services. So again, that was not something that I necessarily had training for, but for me it was really important because it took me back to those social work principles that I learned at university. And I guess the last couple of years I've moved into the healthcare sector, so working at an executive level in a healthcare environment, leading the mission and the values of our organisation. So again, that's a different challenge in a different context, but there's never a day goes by where I don't draw on those social work principles and some of that framework that you learn.
Which I imagine is a bit of a challenge in terms of working at that management level, so kind of knowing the nuts and bolts of where the money's coming from, how the money has to be spent and how the programs need to be delivered. And sometimes tough decisions have to be made because money doesn't come when it needs to come, or the tender doesn't, perhaps not successful for a subsequent tender for a program.
Absolutely.
So you're really in that management level kind of, caught between managing some of those principles around how programs are funded and how you have to report back to your funding body, but then also managing the staff that are actually affected by some of that as well.
I think you actually need to be multilingual, and for me that's about being able to use different language and be able to run with the pack to some extent. And that might sound a bit crude, but if I give an example that might provide a bit more insight. For example, looking at tender writing, being able to find out what sort of language that that they're looking for, be able to you need to be financially literate. I'm not an accountant, and I don't have any financial background. I'm a social worker. So for me, it's about learning more about what is a profit and loss statement. What does that look like? How do I cost out in a funding proposal? How much it's going to cost to run a car and 3 full-time staff and professional development, all that sort of thing. You also need to be bilingual in terms of be able to speak the OH&S and be able to understand the OH&S aspects of our work, which in social work is really important. Quality assurance and quality standards, funding bodies want to see that. And for me, that can be a challenge at times, to be able to roll that out when you have a set of standards that's a requirement for your funding or for your organisation's registration to continue to operate. At the coalface, what does that actually mean for a social worker? So to be able to, I suppose, join the links there and come back to the things about, this is not about, it shouldn't be about compliance, it should be about best practice. So all the time it's about going back to those social work principles. So I think it is really important to be able to be bilingual in terms of being able to use different language for a different audience at different times.
And so do you, in your position at the moment, which is Director of Mission is the title, when you are having some of those conversations and negotiations at that level now, do you identify yourself as a social worker, or when you're saying that you're talking about different language, are you in your management role in that?
I think there are times when you need to adjust your language. So for me, often I'll sit in executive meetings or in meetings with people that perhaps don't come from a social work discipline. So I will adjust my language as we do when we're working with clients. I mean, often if we know as social workers we can get really caught up in jargon, social work jargon, or language that perhaps our clients don't connect with or don't understand. A young person that you work with, you may use different language. A child, you need to make those adjustments. And I think I guess that's what I'm saying, it's parallel in a management role as well. Sometimes you need to alter your language and use different terms that are meaningful to you, but can also engage your audience.
And I guess get the message across that you're wanting to get across to them as well. Yeah. I'll look back at my list here. So you kind of really talked quite a lot there about what your experience has been like as being a manager in that role as well. And I think we've covered quite a range there too in terms of the importance about the way you manage in this environment is about remembering what it's like for people who are at the coalface or who are the frontline workers, and trying to get that balance between what your organisation and what your funding body is saying, this is what we need to see, but and also what's actually going to be workable in the field for social workers. There are some organisations where they don't actually have social workers as managers at that level, and the experience might be slightly different, I guess, for those people as well. Who knows? They might be the same. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think it's a bit different?
I think that we are. Certainly, in my experience, I suppose I've always worked in the not-for-profit sector, but I've had a lot to do with government departments at a state and at a federal level. I think it is being able to adjust your holding centre those core values for you as a person. I think it's important to hold your personal values and your personal beliefs centre and own those and understand those. And I think there are times when it's about how you articulate and how you engage people from other sectors in those conversations. I've had a number of students that have said to me, I never want to be a manager. I'm doing social work because I want to make a difference. I want to be a practitioner. I want to work with people. And I guess for me, I was at that. I started off social work thinking the same thing. And what I was able to identify is that by moving into management or leadership and then management roles, I was able to identify that I can actually still make a difference. And I'm just making a difference, perhaps not at the coalface, but if I can change policy at an organisational level, if I can influence the services that we deliver here in a local region, if I can ensure that we've got great practitioners and work with teams and develop teams and learn from teams as well, and feed that up to funding bodies, that I can make a difference in a managerial role. And for me, that's the motivator, being in management. It's not all about perhaps working in an office, or it's not all about being able to have perhaps a different pay scale or whatever. It's about being able to make a difference.
So the same as just saying, the same values still apply regardless of where you might be in the organisation. One of the, thinking about managerialism and some of the principles behind that in terms of, efficiency and effectiveness, and tendering is all part of, that one of the processes of managerialism as well. One of the, in the literature, one of the criticisms of the managerial perspective to managing human service organisations, so not a criticism of managers, but the overall, perspective of managerialism, is that the role for the professional in that context has been watered down, so that in fact the way that organisations employ people is more about a skill set. So we want people who can do this, not necessarily we want a professional who comes from a particular professional background. So an example of that might be that we want somebody who can fill out an intake form or an assessment form, but the background that they're from or the discipline they're from really doesn't, not that it doesn't matter, but that's not the overriding, I guess, point. It's about, can people fill out this form, so that in fact forms and paperwork and policies and routines have replaced to some extent the need for the professional to make decisions and for their thoughts to come into that. What's your, as I said, that's one of the criticisms, but what's your feeling about that? Or
I think that's very true. I think that often recruitment is geared around skills and attributes and the ability to do the job, and perhaps not so much around the discipline. I think we're seeing more and more of that, and I think I've always encouraged social work students to, I'm very clear that social work has changed my life in lots of ways, professionally and probably personally as well. I think for me, if I reflect on some recent examples, we've opened up a service where we were looking for a multidisciplinary team to work with our clients around mental health issues. So for me, one of the things that was important was to be able to have a mix of different disciplines. So whilst we may have a social worker, we may have a mental health nurse, we may have a psychologist and a psychiatrist working in a mental health setting or mental health service, for me it was about being able to say, yes, they may be doing similar roles, but it's about being able to value add a different perspective or a different discipline. So for example, a social worker may perhaps look more at the psychosocial domains. A psychiatrist perhaps may have a more clinical perspective, so looking at things like medication and be able to work or be able to value add in that perspective. So I think it's about, our services need to be diverse. We need to have diverse disciplines to respond to the diverse needs that we have in our community. What we're seeing is our community is becoming more and more diverse. I work in a regional area in central Victoria where we traditionally have had a very Anglo-Saxon population, if you like. Now what we're seeing is an influx of refugees and different, I suppose, a more diverse, looking at things like disability inclusion and those sorts of things. So we need, as service providers, as a manager, but also as service providers, we need to make sure that we are responding to the needs of our clients. And if they're diversifying, our skill sets need to diversify as well.
Absolutely. So in the way you're talking about it, it's not that there isn't, that the role of the professional isn't important, it's about actually using the professional knowledge in I guess a way that's actually going to match the service need and the need for clients.
Absolutely.
So it's still important, it just might look different to what it has done in previous years.
And I think the beauty of social work is that you can actually specialise in so many different areas, that you can focus in mental health, you can look at early intervention in terms of developmental stages and ages for children or for young people, you can focus in mental health, so disability, aged care. There is so many project work, research. There's just so many different components that you can specialise in.
For sure. And it is, you know, the diversity is one of the strengths really of the profession, I think, as well. So some of the tensions that again come from the literature around working in this, you know, managerialist context in human service organisations is about exactly what you've talked about, the complexity of clients and how do you actually create services to be able to cover the needs of the community and the complex clients. And we talked a bit before about tendering and how that is part of what the environment's like now. And what we saw in the early 90s in particular was a lot of what we refer to as siloed agencies. So agencies actually getting this part of the tender pot and doing this work, but then if a client came with a second issue, they would be referred to another service. And I think there's still a little bit of that that does happen in the way that human service organisations are structured at the moment. Do you think that's changed over the years though, Denis, or is
I think it's starting to change. I think it has changed. I think that funding bodies are wanting to see more partnerships. Lots of consortiums and partnerships are very popular in terms of a funding body. So, and quite often we'll get a contact from another organisation to say, look, are you interested in partnering with us? What could this look like? And again, I really support that. I think that that's really important to partner with other agencies and other stakeholders in our community. So whether they're organisations or not, whether it's about a reference group or inviting someone from a very diverse background in. I know here I work in healthcare, so looking at how we can engage some of our consumers of our healthcare services from different, not just being a patient in a bed, but also looking at things like some of our rehab, our outpatient rehab, or having someone with a disability on the patient group, consumer group, or someone from a COLT background. So I think that's really important. The other part, or I suppose the other response that I have, is the importance of advocacy.
Yeah.
That's really important in managerialism, and it's really important that if our funding bodies are saying that, you know, we want to fund you for this, to do this, we need to really advocate, and that's where partnerships come into play as well, where collectively you can advocate back to say, yes, you're funding us to do this, however we think that that's not enough money, or that's, you know, the region's not correct, we need to make that broader, or it's too limiting. And to be able to be proactive in data collection and looking at research and how do we back up what we're saying about this particular group, or being proactive instead of waiting for a funding round to come out, actually starting to collect that data and work with other agencies to be collectively go forward and say, this is something that you need to fund, and this is why, and here's the data to back it up.
And again, another strength of social work, to be able to actually, you know, be a strong advocate, but also to be able to do the research and say, here is what we're seeing.
Absolutely.
And then being able to kind of push that forward as well, which is important. And I think an underestimated part of social work sometimes, and even from a student perspective, you know, when they're perhaps doing the research subjects, not being quite sure about, you know, how that might fit into the everyday practice. But that's a great example of where it really does, to be able to see those points.
And I think if you take that back to if I was a practitioner or a graduate and I'm working with a client, a young person or an older person, whatever, one of the things that's really important is to be able to evaluate your own practice. It's just at a different scale, and it's a different audience, and there's different inputs, I suppose, but it is about saying, how do I know I'm being effective with my work with this client? How am I going to know that? So it might be I need to have those conversations with the client, ask for feedback, check in, you know, review the goals that you set at the beginning of the service. How are we going to know when our work together is finished? How will you know when you've achieved what you set out to achieve as in your goals? So that's why I keep going back to this transfer of skill set. It's just in a different context, perhaps.
One of the other things that comes up around the managerial environment is the risk environment, and you touched on OH&S earlier, and I guess that is something that you know, I've seen kind of shape the way that services are delivered. And I guess a good example of that is where, when I started in the field in the early 90s, it was not unusual for us to go out and do home visits, and to do those home visits as sole workers, and that was before mobile phones and, you know, any of that kind of quick accessibility back. But I think there has been a change in the delivery of services that are partly around needs for clients, but also partly around organisations' concerns around what sort of risk does this put the client at, what sort of risk does this put the worker at, and some of the financial, I guess, concerns around insurances and liabilities around that.
Certainly as a manager you hold a different, perhaps a different level of responsibility in terms of things like a liability and facing litigation and those sorts of things, because under OH&S legislation, managers and people in key positions that are running organisations can be actually held personally accountable if they're proven to be negligent. So there's some of that, but I think that it is certainly there has been a shift, and I think we need to be. It's always a tension as a manager to be able to weigh up risk and not let risk overrun or take over in terms of determining how we provide our services. It's certainly I don't want to minimise it. It's certainly something that you need to consider in the shaping of your services, in the way that you have your policies laid out, your practice and your procedures laid out. But I think for me it's about being able to identify, well, what are the risks, and working with the frontline staff around what do you see as the risks? What are the risks? Let's look at our risk register. Do we have a risk register? When was the last time that was reviewed? Is it something that sits on the shelf, or is it alive, a document? And I think it's about having connection with those, with practitioners on the front line to be able to say, well, practically, how do we reduce this risk? Give me your insight. What's important in terms of the service delivery, and being able to relate to each other around that. Because there are ways. It might be around looking at a different assessment tool to be able to look at risk and assess risk. It may be that the first visit's in the office. Yeah. It may be, you know, 2 workers doing a home visit for a couple of sessions. There's always ways around that. And for me, I started my social work career in a similar way, outreach in families' homes, no mobile phone, those sorts of things. But there's no way I would allow that to happen now, because we've got different resources, and it's about also identifying what are the other resources we need and how do we fund those and get that balance.
Yeah, and also what are you funded to do too, in terms of...
Absolutely.
You know, it is, and because if the funding isn't saying, well, we're funding you for, you know, a car, a mobile phone, for 2 workers to go on a visit, then the organisation has to find the money somewhere else to be able to do that. So it's weighing up, and I mean, it does sound terrible too, but it is weighing up the cost of the delivery of service. And sometimes I think that does drive then, okay, well, what can we do in terms of, you know, keeping workers safe, which is going to be a priority, and keeping clients safe. Maybe it is telephone, you know, work. Maybe it is people have to come to the office, and if they can't get here, you know.
I think some of the most creative solutions are actually come from our frontline key staff, and from, you know, talking to other partners. How do you do this? How do you provide the outreach service, and networking, and being able to tap into other resources that are out in the community. Certainly, the organisation I work for at the moment, we have a set of standards which cover lots of different areas, and one is around safety and around occupational health and well-being. But we've got to work with that, and those standards and those regulations around quality and around OH&S are there for a reason, and that's to keep everyone safe. So it's about being able to negotiate and work within that those challenges.
And there are lots of challenges, as you've mentioned, but, you know, also hear through what you're saying that there are lots of opportunities to be creative and to bring those social work core values to the front and think about, well, okay, you know, I'm in terms of my role, this is what I am funded to do. Here's a gap that I can see. How do I go about actually bridging that gap so it doesn't actually stop you from, you know, working in a social work way around that?
I think one of the challenges that I've faced perhaps in the past is, as a manager, you can try to engage. How do you engage your frontline people in this? Because, and I've been there myself as a practitioner, saying that's the quality person's job, or that's the OH&S person's job. I'm kind of more interested in helping people, and that attitude is not really all that productive or helpful. And I think in being able to, whilst it may seem boring or it may seem irrelevant, as a frontline practitioner, if you can get engaged or engage some of the people in quality roles, your expertise is really important. And if you don't, you run the risk of actually, you know, decisions being made without that client perspective. Which is always a challenge, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it is important to be active, and for managers to engage and consult with frontline staff around that.
Yeah, you're right. In the busyness of the work, you know, I've probably been guilty too, I think, of seeing an email coming through and here's a draft policy around, you know, home visit procedures or something, and thinking, oh, look, you know, someone's dealing with that, I've got to get on with the busyness of the day. And you're absolutely right, then decisions do get made. And then as workers you go, oh, hang on a minute, that doesn't actually work. What's going on here? But you've missed the boat by not being engaged earlier on as well. All right, well, thank you for that. Before we finish up though, I might just quickly talk about professionalism and how you kind of, you know, we've talked about a fairly complex, I guess, human service sector at the moment, the way that the funding happens and a few things that might result in as well. And so I'm really interested in how people do remain a social worker in that environment, or develop a sense of their professionalism or their profession, I guess, professional identity, I think is what I'm trying to say, in that environment. And I wonder, you know, what does that mean to you in terms of professional identity in this environment?
One of the things that that I do at the moment is that every month I will go out and spend a day in one of the areas that I manage. So the mental health service that I referred to earlier, be able to go out and spend the day working in that service.
Yep.
And to be able to look at some client files, to be able to sit at the front desk and welcome clients in and have dialogue. And I think for me that's really powerful because it gives me a sense of connecting with my team.
Yep.
It gives me a sense of awesome insight into and reminders about what are the challenges that our frontline practitioners are facing in this work. I've in the past gone out on home visits as well.
Mm-hmm.
I've been gone back to working with, co-working with a family, and unfortunately, it's really difficult to find time to do that. And as a manager, that's not your core. It could be debated, but it doesn't. It's not necessarily part of my position description, but it's something that is valued by my CEO and by my other executive team. And we go out and we spend time. And I think it's really powerful to be able to be reminded of what it's like on the front line, and it gives you a different perspective. It's not about the undercover boss. It's not about going in and spying and seeing what's happening. So your motives need to be genuine, I think, as a manager in terms of going out and doing that. And I think the other thing that's important is communicating that to the people that you'll be going to spend the day with, so that they know what your intentions are. So that's it's becoming more and more part of our culture in the organisation that I work now. So that's one way. I think the other way is about being able to, again, go out of your way. It shouldn't be something that you have to go out of your way for, but to go out of your way and make sure that you're touching base with people that work in the field. And even if that's having lunch with them or stopping and saying hello. And I would encourage graduates and practitioners who are working in the field now to invite your managers to say, hey, do you want to ride with me for the day? Or, hi, how was your day? And what's your day been like today? So, because what I find is that often in organisations there can be a wall or a them and us between the frontline people and managers, and it doesn't have to be like that. And we've all got to work harder at trying to break down some of those barriers.
Yeah, for sure. And as you're saying, it's everyone, isn't it? It's not just the manager, it's not just the frontline practitioner, but it's everybody actually saying it's important to us to not have that us and them kind of division.
I think other ways are things like looking at becoming a member of the AASW or sourcing journals to keep up with reading in professional contemporary social work practice. I'm not an academic person in terms of I don't do a lot of reading, but for me it's about the way I engage in that is I keep my finger on the pulse with what's happening in organisations, even basic things like looking at tenders that are up in on different websites or in newspapers, vacancies, so who's moving, knowing who to go to if you need information about a particular area, having key contacts. And many of those contacts I actually started building when I first was in the field. So knowing that a particular organisation locally or nationally or internationally have expertise in a particular area. So if there's something that I need to know about, I've got some networks within that or some people within that network that I can go to and say, hey, look, can you help me with this, or I need to know more about, or I don't understand, those sort of things.
Networking is so important, isn't it, really, in terms of not just getting the work done for clients, but in terms of actually staying connected to the field yourself and being known, and in fact being one of the people that other people come to ask to be involved and to partner in things as well. Is really important.
And from small things, great things grow. So it might seem that 15 years ago I may have been working with this person who used to work at Child Protection or in another organisation, but now they're in a different role, and that relationship's been going for 10 or 15 years, and we can now work together to come up with an idea or a proposal or a concept. So it is really important. That's another way of maintaining, I suppose, that professionalism and professional practice.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time.
It's okay.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we finish up?
I guess probably my final message would be, don't ever say no. Don't ever say, oh, I won't be a manager in a social work organisation. Just be open-minded to it, because I think for me some of it happened, it just happened.
Yeah.
And or it started to happen, and then I could identify this is where I want to get to. And the path always has changed for me at different points in my career. I think that social work is a really important discipline. I think it offers lots of opportunities for people, and I guess it's about engagement and being open to working with your manager, and also managers working with frontline social workers.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Natasha.